Ooh. Hello, YouTubers! My name is Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have Orks. This is reaction request video number 85. Now, the requesters have Brutality 616, Lord Cadus Lives, Kevin Barber, and Samuel. And this video is made by Arch Warhammer. So let's check it out. Alright, play. Another Arch video.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to today's 40k lore video on the Orks, the great green menace of the 41st millennium, also known as the magical cockroaches of 40k, as they have survived not only the war in the heavens, but also the Empire dominance that followed, and the Great Crusade. Not a whole lot of races capable of traversing the galaxy can say the same, and the best part is they didn't survive off the back of some high-tech nonsense like the Eldar Webway or massive-ass spacefaring continents, or with the guidance of some supremely overpowered Goldilocks like the Emperor. The Orks survived through sheer bloody-minded determination and a blissful ignorance of their position. Orks do not panic easily, and the relatively trivial fact that they are surrounded and outnumbered on a galactic scale ain't no big thing. In fact, it could even be considered a bonus, as the Orks will not have to look far for a fight under these circumstances. And that, in the end, is the only thing the Orks really care about. And to explain that, we have to start out by explaining the physiology of the Orks. To begin with, the race we know as Orks consist of several subspecies that vary greatly in their capabilities, their size, and their intelligence. Starting out with a particularly robust and not particularly intelligent species of fungus, followed by the marginally more intelligent and vastly more aggressive squig, which is followed by the first vaguely orc-ish kind of intelligent member of the orcoid species, the snotling. This is also the first one to at least look like an orc. Then we have the slightly larger and slightly smarter Gretchen, followed finally by a big angry orc. And seeing as Orc society is based almost entirely on the idea that might makes right, the social hierarchy of the Orcs is pretty simple. The fungus is food, the squigs are food and occasionally savage pets, the snotlings are also food in a pinch, but primarily acts as a source of amusement for the larger orcs and also serve in an agricultural role, growing and tending to the fungus and the squigs that the orcs occasionally keep as extremely dangerous livestock. The Gretchen are only slightly higher on the social pecking order, but they are at least very rarely used as a food source, or at the very least as a main food source. They do occasionally serve as a light snack, but that's beside the point. They are instead used as slave labor to pretty much anything the Orks can't be asked to do themselves, really. However, it is not entirely a dead-end job, as particularly skilled, or good at lying, Gretchen might be given semi-important roles like mechanic or overseer, where they get to boss other Gretchens around. At this point, you might be thinking that this sounds like a remarkably well-organized society by Orc standards, and if the various subspecies would actually do the job assigned to them, you would be right. However, the orc species has an anger management problem, and with that I don't mean that they have a trouble controlling their anger, though that is also part of the problem. I mean that they quite literally have angry management. You see, all orcs, with the possible exception of the mushrooms, are remarkably hateful and angry creatures and will constantly be on the watch for any opportunity to vent their frustration on anyone perceived to be smaller, and thereby weaker, than themselves. This creates a fairly hostile work environment that could be put forth as a living example of the saying, shit always rolls downhill, and what comes around goes around. As the warboss slaps the orc kicks the Gretchen sets the snotling on fire, and the snotling runs screaming into the livestock/fungus farm, spreading the burning love around and resulting in very angry and slightly singed squigs rampaging through the camp and biting the warlord in the arse. Then the warlord goes off to find the orc that is supposedly responsible for farms, and this time he has something considerably more, creative in mind than a mere slap. And so, the wonderful cycle of life and/or perpetual violence continues.
Jeez.
It also doesn't really help that all members of the orc species always look out for numero uno, and cooperation is considered a truly filthy word. But after that slight sidetrack, let's move on to the proper greenskins, the orcs. The orc is the biggest and strongest of the greenskin species, and as such, they are almost always the ones in charge, and they can vary in size and strength far more than the smaller greenskins, from normal boys to the bigger knobs, and the biggest of them all, the warboss, and even warbosses can vary in size and strength and be subjected to other bigger and badder warbosses, usually being referred to as knobs, unless he is in command of a tribe within a larger hierarchy like a warg. The reason for this variety is that orc grow in a very different manner from humans, or indeed most sentient creatures. An orc will never stop growing, though the rate at which he grows can vary greatly based on his position in the orc hierarchy. Essentially, whenever an orc is able to achieve something, usually something violent, like beating up another orc for example, he will grow faster for a time. And he will also become more aggressive and more likely to start fights with other orcs. And so, the orcs keep growing until he runs into someone bigger and badder than him. And assuming the orcs live through the confrontation, he will calm down for time and stop growing quite so rapidly before, trying again. This constant cycle of aggressive growth in combination with the extremely high reproductive rates of orcs means that an orc tribe is constantly getting more and more powerful, as those already at the top have to fight off increasing numbers of increasingly tough opponents. The bigger the tribe gets, the faster this process ramps up, though there is a limit to how much a tribe can grow in size and power just by fighting itself, and so the tribe goes off in search of other orcs to punch until one tribe has, for lack of a better word, united all the others under the rule of the biggest and the baddest warboss. And naturally, when the orcs run out of orcs to punch, they go looking for someone else to punch. But before we get into that, we are not yet quite done talking about orcs.
For fighting's sake.
Now that you know about their social hierarchy and their growth, it is time to look at what an orc is on a biological level. To make a long story short, an orc is in essence a symbiotic creature combining animal and fungus in brutal harmony. The animal, or orc side, is the dominant one and makes up most of the body, while the fungus takes care of internal functions. Indeed, the fungus is so effective at this role that the orcs are able to do without a lot of otherwise vital organs, replacing them with a crude yet effective replacements. Actually, referring to it as organs is slightly misleading, as with the exception of a large multi-chambered stomach, a crude but effective heart, and a poop chute, there is very little in the way of organs as we would know them. The function of most of our biochemical organs, like the liver, kidneys, spleen, etc., is instead handled in orcs by a thick, semi-liquid fungal soup that flows around inside the orc's body. These liquid organs are more or less contained within further fungal growth that serve both to keep the organs in the right place and as shock absorbers, protecting the other non-liquid organs inside the body. Generally speaking, it is fairly safe to assume that wherever you look inside an orc's body, there is going to be fungus living in a symbiotic relationship with the orc itself, providing all the kinds of benefits to the host in return for a place to live and its fair share of the orc's energy. And speaking of energy, although orcs do possess a highly effective stomach and will gladly eat and drink virtually anything, they also possess a crude form of photosynthesis, allowing them to stay alive and angry with the absolute minimum of supplies. Combine that with their willingness and occasional eagerness to eat other greenskins, and you can imagine that they don't starve easily. Additionally, orc bones are extremely thick and robust, but also surprisingly flexible thanks to a spongy fungus matter growing inside the bones. This means that it's very, very hard to break or even fracture an orc's bones, and nearly impossible with a short-duration high-energy impact like, for example, a bullet. Lastly, there is the brain. The orc brain is quite large and similar in structure to that of a human, but in orcs the so-called old brain is the most developed part. This is the part that controls the more basic functions of our mind and goes some way to explaining why the orcs are so danged aggressive. It's also worth mentioning that the cranium is practically the only part of an orc's body that is entirely free of fungus. All of this together results in an extremely tough cookie that can take a downright savage pounding and come out of it a little worse for wear. And even if an orc sustains massive damage, it is quite likely that given time and even the most rudimentary of treatments, the orc will not only survive, but make a full recovery. And all of this then leads us to the question, could this possibly be a natural creature? The orcs show little to no sign of having evolved, and yet they have become the perfect biological embodiment of a blunt object. No matter how magical nature is, it seems hard to imagine that orcs developed through natural means. Additionally, there are mentions in Eldar lore that the Old Ones created a race of savage and brutal green-skinned creatures to use in the war in the heavens, so it seems quite reasonable to assume that the orcs were engineered by the Old Ones specifically to fight their wars. It does seem a bit of a desperate gamble, as the orcs could never be controlled in the same way that, for example, the Eldar could, but, well, when you're fighting immortal god vampires that eat stars, you might have to throw caution to the wind. Lastly, before moving on to what the orcs do when there are no more orcs around to punch, we need to think about how they move on to find and smack new people. As you have probably already guessed, the orcs are not the brightest mushrooms in the bag, and so it seems somewhat insane that the angry fungus lovers can build the guns, never mind spaceships. The knowledge to build these things are essentially stored inside certain orcs' brains, and is unlocked as the orcs grow bigger, stronger, and therefore more powerful, and therefore more likely to survive within the orc hierarchy. This gives the so-called mech boys an instinctive understanding of how to build and operate certain weapons and vehicles, along with a rudimentary understanding of how they operate, which allows them to experiment in more fanciful and innovative ways of doing things, like building a helicopter without the rotary blades, for example. It doesn't have to work, it doesn't even have to be logical, but if you fling enough mud at the wall, some of it is eventually bound to stick. This knowledge is enough to create simple stuff like guns, trucks, or simple mechanized armor and prosthetics, but to make the really big things, like gargants or spaceships, the instinctive knowledge is only half the formula. The other half, for lack of a better word, is magic, or to be more specific, the psychic power that resides within all orcs that can be channeled through certain greenskins. For example, a small orc tribe of a couple hundred members might only have a single mech boy, and he can't really make anything more interesting than single-shot gunpowder weapons. But as the tribe grows larger, the mech boy becomes more proficient and can start making proper guns. Eventually, the tribe grows to the point where they have several mech boys, and this lets them undertake bigger projects like building vehicles. And so this is where the magic comes in. For now, we will simply refer to it as Warg energy, and minute amounts of this energy is produced constantly by every single orc. The amount produced is primarily dependent on three factors. Firstly, the size of the orc, secondly, the aggression of the orc, and thirdly, the numbers of orcs nearby. This energy is not used solely to build things, but also to make them work. Something like a truck is no big deal and functions more or less like any other vehicle, except for being far sturdier than its ramshackle construction would suggest and give it any real reason to be. Something like a gargant, however, would quite literally not be possible without warg energy, as the laws of physics states quite insistently that the gargant should simply collapse under its own weight, and yet, not only doesn't it collapse, but is able to move and fire its weapons that should have ripped it apart with their mere recoil. And that goes double, nay, triple for orc spaceships. In any sane universe, these things would tear themselves apart simply by starting the engines. Never mind traveling across the depths of space and the warp. Now, the reason all of this works is because of how chaos works in 40k. I've already done a video on that, so if you want to know more, I suggest taking a look at it, but suffice to say, if the orcs believe something will work, and if there's enough orcs around that also believe that it will work, then it will work. Thusly, the orcs have created interplanetary travel quite literally by sheer bloody-minded determination and a bold refusal to accept reality. This does, however, come with one drawback. If the numbers of orcs start dropping, then shit stops working, and if the numbers drop low enough, the orcs will return to a feral state and start using sticks with the rocks tied to the ends as weapons instead of tanks and rockets. This is not something that worries the orcs overmuch, though, as only a weak grot would ever worry about anything past the next fight, and now that they have gotten their grubby green fingers on space travel, the next fight is bound to be a good one. So, back to what the orcs do when they go looking for something else to wallop. To start out, these newly minted space travelers will start roaming around their local system to bring the glorious word of their twin deities Gork and Mork to their neighbors, and then punch their teeth in and steal all of their stuff. Once the local meet and greet is finished, the orcs will have built themselves a ramshackle fleet and are now ready to evangelize the hopefully aggressive species of other systems. The orcs are more than capable of traveling at speeds faster than light by utilizing the warp, much like how the Imperium does, but with one small difference. Whereas the Imperium creates bubbles of normal space around themselves while traveling in an effort to ward off the less than friendly creatures that live in the warp, the orcs prefer a more assertive approach. An orc fleet simply tears its
Sort of.
ways into the warp, projecting a bubble of
Oh,
Ork
man.
energies around itself. The difference sounds minor, but the effect is quite different. The Imperial way of doing things is like trying to slip through a crowded room without drawing any attention to yourself, and so avoid conversing with those in the room. The Ork
Makes
way
sense.
is more akin to a very, very large and hairy man running screaming through the room, trusting in his sheer bulk and violence to clear a path. The latter, as you may well
Nice.
imagine, attracts a bit more attention to itself, but as far as the Orks are concerned, the occasional incursion by demons is a welcome break from the boredom of space travel. This way of traversing the distance
Nice.
between stars has a fairly high attrition rate due to its somewhat obvious nature, but the Orks couldn't really care less, choosing instead to adapt a plenty more where they came from, and it's not like it's ever going to happen to me stance. Besides, at the end of the rainbow that is space travel, there's a whole bunch of new and interesting life forms to brutalize. It is important to mention, though, that this roving and raiding
Fresh
behavior
meat.
is not necessarily the same as a warg. First, let me tell you what a warg is, or more correct, and by the way, the usual warnings apply for those of you with the sound cranked up, as in all Ork videos. Ahem. 3, 2, 1. Warg! Now, no self-respecting Ork would ever merely speak the word warg, as to them it isn't even really a word in all due technicality. It's a prayer, a war cry, and, well, their very identity, really, all rolled into one. And as such, to give the sound the proper gravitas that it deserves, it should always be shouted. But if I as a human were to do that, it would be cultural appropriation, so I will stick to the less loud version. So, back to the point, a warg is a massive movement of orcs from hundreds and often thousands of various tribes containing millions upon millions of orcs, and usually with some vague goal in mind and steered in the rough direction of said goal by a truly mighty orc warboss. And we are talking a
Nice.
big old warboss here. Essentially, he has to be so big and violent that all the other warbosses would never even dream of challenging him. Thankfully, such individuals are quite rare, and most wargs fall flat on their face as the various orc tribes assimilated by the warboss begin to fight in amongst themselves. In fact, the overwhelming majority of spacefaring orcs are fairly small and insignificant warbands locked in constant warfare with other groups of orcs for dominance. These groups usually don't amount to more than a passing threat to imperial trade, never mind a planetary or system-level threat. A proper warg, though, can drown entire star systems under a never-ending tide of belligerent and smelly fungus monsters. And on a handful of occasions, the orcs have posed a truly galactic-scale threat to the Imperium, and at one point nearly did what the heresy could not. So, do not be fooled by their apparent lack of technology and savage nature. The orcs have fought on equal footing with Astartes' legions. In fact, it took the Emperor himself at the head of his Adeptus Custodes and the Lunar Wolves, led by Horus Lupercal, to finally break the orcs on Ulanor during the Great Crusade. There's not a whole lot of races that can claim they presented so much as a speed bump to the legions, much less fucking fought them. And while it is certainly true that the orcs tend to be somewhat predictable opponents, there are orcs capable of quite considerable levels of strategic thinking, and some of the more powerful warbosses have given some of the sharpest military minds in the Imperium a run for their money. And, of course, if military brilliance isn't enough to claim victory, then sheer crushing numerical and material superiority is a damn good leveler. Just ask the Soviets if you ever need proof of that. And In many ways, you could argue that a brutally forward strategy is the one that best fits the Orks. They excel in massive all-out assaults that will roll unstoppably forwards without caring the slightest whit about casualties or safety. But the truly dangerous war bosses are those with the ability to turn this mass charge of orcs and tanks from a headless mob of uncontrolled elements with no goal but to fight whatever is in front of them into the very embodiment of deep operations warfare. Those amongst you with knowledge of military history will know exactly what I am talking about. The ideas of deep operations seems almost designed for orcs. A virtually inexhaustible supply of orcs, guns, and tanks with which to assault the enemy all across his line, and force breakthroughs with mechanized and motorized elements can pour through without so much as a thought given to supplying or supporting them. Hell, even if the break is closed and the mobile elements are surrounded and annihilated, so bloody what? There is no shortage of replacements. And best of all, there's no need for barrier troops or rousing speeches to motivate the Green Horde for battle. In most cases, a war boss's primary challenge before the battle begins is to prevent his boys from charging too soon. And even if the Green Menace can be driven from planet, it is virtually impossible to completely wipe them out. This has to do with their reproductive methods. Every orc is constantly pumping out minute amounts of fungus spores simply by breathing. These spores are extremely hardy and can survive both in extreme cold and heat, and form fungus colonies that will eventually start producing the smaller type of greenskins. These first snotlings will then begin tending the fungus patches, helping them to grow and spread, and eventually goblins and then fully grown orcs will start appearing. The only countermeasure is a planet-wide program of extermination, followed by meticulous cleansing of every single place, nook, and cranny the orcs have passed through, usually involving large numbers of flamethrowers. This process, as you can probably guess, takes decades, and even then the chances of a complete cleansing of the planet are slim to none. In most cases, the population will simply have to live with the added danger of small-scale orc incursions for as long as there are humans on the planet. Now, there have been some countermeasures made and put in place to prevent this. Generally speaking, if the orcs are already on the planet, getting rid of them is going to be far more complicated than making sure they're not on the planet to begin with. As such, Imperial doctrine dictates that the best way to deal with an orc wog is to never let it happen in the first place. Orc wogs are rarely a surprise, as they are somewhat large, smelly, and noisy, and based on fairly predictable variables, like, for example, the numbers of orcs and the strength of their leaders. One will inevitably produce the other, but a wog can't get going without both. And so the Imperium will launch punitive crusades into orc-held space with the goal of killing rather than conquering, preferably by catching and destroying their ships and then subjecting the planets to orbital bombardment, as this is by far the safest way. Alternatively, attempts will be made to eliminate any war bosses that looks like he's starting to get big enough to unite the usually warring tribes. If possible, these assassinations will be carried out by the Officio Assassinarum, but if no such assets can be employed, the orc in question will have to be eliminated by more conventional means with ground forces. Preferably Adeptus Astartes, the Ultramarines in particular have made quite a reputation out of hunting and killing orc war bosses to prevent wogs. That might at some point pose a threat to Ultramar. But the Emperor's avenging angels are not always available, and in such cases, where the might of the Adeptus Astartes cannot be brought to bear, the poor bloody guard will have to suffice. And this might even seem like a waste of resources to employ entire battle fleets and companies of Space Marines simply to reduce the numbers of orcs or to kill off a war boss or two, but generally speaking, it is far, far cheaper, both in terms of men and materials, to undergo these occasional culling operations instead of having to fight off a full warg. And so the
Makes
great
sense.
circle of punching goes on and on in the orcish paradise. Now, there are quite a few things of the orcs that I have not mentioned in this video, as by the usual standards it is quite impossible to cover everything in a single video, so there will of course be more coming on the orcs and everyone else. But for now, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you soon. Have a good day.
Okay, well, that was Da Orks. Very entertaining. It's pretty neat to figure out how these creatures live, how they survive, and what their interest is. Punch anything that moves, apparently. But yes, this video was created by Arch. There's a link in the description, so go check him out if you aren't checking him out already. Again, this video was requested by Brutality616, Lord Cadus Lives, Kevin Barber, and Samuel. Thank you for requesting this video. It was quite interesting, and it's nice to learn more about this universe, and quite entertaining video indeed. So thank you. That's pretty much all I got to say about that. So, Willie, out.
If you like the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to comment. Have a good one.